Hi, my name is Jack Amendolia and I work for a firm called Watson and Associates. We were hired to help the board with the school boundary review that they're conducting for all their schools in the city of Oshawa. There are a lot of schools involved and a lot of moving parts, and the school board thought it would be helpful to do some short videos for each school community to explain why the board is doing a citywide boundary review in Oshawa and how it might impact their school communities.
So before we get into any specific data or scenarios that are impacting the St. Hedwig school and community, I just want to take a minute to talk a little bit about the process and then a bit about why a school board might do a school boundary review and some of the conditions that are typically present.
The material that is being presented is based on options that the Board of Trustees agreed to have staff take to the community for input. These are not the final recommendations, but really are intended to provide potential options for your input and feedback. The committee, made up of various board staff, school principals, and a school council representative from each school, will review the feedback and then prepare final recommendations. Those recommendations will be brought back to all of Oshawa via virtual meeting on May 4th, 2023. So why does a school board do a school boundary review or an attendance area review? Well, there's a variety of reasons why a board might conduct a review. Right now, we're going to explore some of the main ones. One of the primary reasons is enrollment pressures, and that means when the enrollment at a school is significantly over what that school was built for. And a school board looks at boundary reviews or changing those boundaries as a way to try to alleviate that enrollment. Again, assuming there are schools close by or somewhat close by that can take that additional enrollment. The other reason why a board might consider a boundary review is when a new school opens. If that new school requires a new boundary and it impacts some of the existing schools, again, a boundary review may be necessary to determine what that new school's boundary will look like. Another reason is an enrollment imbalance, similar to the first point about enrollment pressures. The school board may have some schools that are significantly over capacity. They may have some schools that are under capacity, and they may need to just try to better balance or equalize enrollment for those various schools. And then the last one is program. So if a board has, for example, a French immersion program, and they are looking to either expand that program or offer it in a different way or change the boundaries of that program, that's another reason why a school board might do a boundary review. In the case of this review, and like I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, it's a citywide review, fairly complex, a lot of schools involved. And the other thing is that all of these things, all of these reasons about why a school board might do a boundary review are present in some form in the City of Oshawa review.
What we're looking at here are the enrollments by school. What we've shown on this table are all the schools, both elementary and secondary, that are a part of the Oshawa review. We've also highlighted certain data with respect to capacities of the school. So the OTG column stands for on the ground capacity. That refers to the permanent capacity that the school was built and designed for. It does not include temporary spaces or portables. All the enrollments are here by grade, JK all the way to grade 8. We show total enrollment, and then the utilization is simply a percentage of the enrollment related to the capacity. So if you had a school built for 300 and you had 300 kids there, your utilization would be 100%. When we start to focus in on St. Hedwig, and that's highlighted by that red box, the school is quite small. It was built for a permanent capacity of 159. It has about 119 students as of October 31st, 2022, for a utilization rate of 75%. And one thing we see is when we look at this table, there's quite a diversity of utilization rates and variance across the city. But for the most part, one thing that would probably jump out at you is that most of the schools and elementary schools in the city of Oshawa are either at capacity or above capacity. There's really only two schools that are showing up that have some surplus space. One is St. Hedwig and the other is St. John the 23rd. The next slide, we're going to look at some very similar data, but all we've done here is broken it out by regular English track programming as well as French immersion programming. So right now in the city of Oshawa, the school board offers French immersion programming at 3 of its elementary schools. There are what's referred to as dual track schools because they offer both English and French instruction. And when we look at the total number of French immersion students, about 537 elementary French immersion students in the city represents about 11.5% of the total elementary enrollment in the city. And the 3 schools that it's offered at are St. Christopher, St. Kateri, and St. Thomas. The percentage of total enrollment that makes up F5 varies at those schools. At St. Kateri, it's about 41%. At St. Christopher, about 29%. And at St. Thomas, about 36%. So the next couple of things we'll look at are just trying to get an idea of what these boundaries look like. So we've talked about school boundaries and different things we try to do, and we've shown you some enrollments and some capacities and utilizations, but I think it's helpful and provides some context if we know sort of what these boundaries look like. So what this map is showing is all the school boundaries in the city of Oshawa elementary schools that are involved in this review. Gives you a sense of how big or small they are, where they are in the city, where they are in relation to each other, where the school facility is located in that boundary. Those are denoted by the little yellow buildings with flags. And then on the next slide, we carry on the theme with looking at school boundaries in a spatial way. But what we wanted to show here relates back to the utilization of capacity rates I spoke about a minute ago. What we're looking at is the same boundaries, but what we've done is we've attached a heat map to them. So anywhere you kind of see the oranger or redder colors, those are enrollment pressures, schools operating with high utilization rates well above capacity. Where you see sort of this greeny type color, typically schools operating around capacity, and where you see the sort of blue cooler colors, those are schools that have surplus space.
The scenarios considered for part of this review really fall into a few main categories. The first one is school boundary changes. So we're talking about a traditional school boundary change where we look at moving the line to either make the boundary larger or smaller. The second is grade structure changes. So the new approved Monsignor Paul Dwyer Secondary School has been approved as a grade 7 to 12 school. So as part of this review, the board is interested in hearing from the community about possibly which grade 7 and 8 from which schools should go to the new secondary school. And the third main part of this review had to deal with French immersion programming. As we talked about previously, there's currently 3 dual track French immersion schools. So we looked at a diverse set of options all the way from status quo, leaving it as it is, to 1 single track facility for the whole city, multiple single track facilities, combinations of single track and dual track. So really all options were considered.
So now we're going to get into looking at how some of the scenarios we discussed with the public and talked about a minute ago with some of the things we are trying to focus on. Let's take a look at how some of these things directly impact St. Hedwig. I think the first thing to mention is that there are no standalone scenarios or options that have been considered for St. Hedwig. The options that I'm going to speak about in a minute really are contingent upon other things in this review happening, and I'll explain a little bit in more detail what I mean by that. So the first option has to do with a boundary change. So what is being proposed is that St. Thomas Aquinas, basically the eastern half of St. Thomas Aquinas's boundary would move east into St. Hedwig. Why are we considering something like that? Because some of the other recommendations dealing more specifically with programming and French immersion, one of them is looking at turning St. Thomas Aquinas into a single track French immersion facility. Obviously, if that was done, the current English enrollment in that school would have to be dispersed. And one of the recommendations surrounds dispersing that English enrollment to St. Christopher as well as to St. Hedwig. So that's the first implication of some of the scenarios. The second one, very, very similar. It's still looking at a portion of St. Thomas's English enrollment going to St. Hedwig. However, in this case, the sort of plan resulting from that is is slightly different. That St. Thomas would still become or still stay as a dual track French immersion facility. However, under that scenario, would still be expected to take a good chunk of St. Christopher's French immersion enrollment, and as a result, would have to create a little bit of space by moving some of the English enrollment out of St. Thomas and into St. Hedwig. So the impacts on St. Hedwig are very, very similar. In option one, there are just a few more students that would be proposed to move from Thomas to Hedwig. In option two, it's a little bit fewer students. So what would happen under these scenarios to St. Hedwig? Like I said, it's operating at around 75%. Under this scenario, it would utilizations would increase to about 109%, but then drop slightly below 100 in the longer term. Obviously, in the option that we looked at previously, these rates would be a little bit higher because there's a few more students that would be proposed to come over. So the implications, I think I just went through, they're pretty much the same in both scenarios. Again, to reiterate, there's no standalone implications. These would only be required if there were other decisions made with regard to some of the other options the board is looking at. But basically, in all of the options affecting Hedwig, its boundary it would be proposed to increase, take in a few more students, and increase utilization rates.
To finish off tonight's presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about what we've heard so far from the Oshawa community. So we've had a couple of community level meetings. We've had some committee level meetings. We've had a couple of surveys that have gone out to the public, as well as feedback that can be provided to the board through a general email address. And from that feedback, there's a couple of things that are starting to come from it. One thing that we're starting to hear is that there seems to be a preference for single track French immersion programming. There seems to be a preference for two facilities in the city of Oshawa rather than one. When I want specifically with regard to single track French immersion programming. A lot of the feedback wants to see a reduction in this enrollment pressure that we spoke about. There is a concern or a consideration to try as much as we can to keep communities together. And the public also wants us to consider with regard to any changes that might be made, what transportation implications there are, how long students might be on a bus for. When we look at one question that we were asked, or that we asked the community early on in the process, what are some of the initial issues you see with some of the existing conditions at your school? You can see that about 50%, a little bit over 50% of the responses are either enrollment pressures or too many portables. So I think there's a clear understanding in the community that there's schools that are operating above capacity, and that something needs to be done to deal with some of that enrollment pressure. And that's why the board is undergoing this boundary review. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video tonight. I hope you found it informative, but if there are any questions, we will continue to reach out to the community. A lot of information can be found on the board's website and a couple of meetings coming up. Thank you.